We are with Professor Aleh Tsyvinski from Yale University and co-director of the macroeconomic program for Cowley's Foundation. Hello, Professor Tsyvinski. Welcome to Galicia. Welcome to Fundación Barrié, and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you very much.
Let me begin with an approach to the subject of your lecture today. Can you give us a brief outline of your research in dynamic optimal taxation?
So the key issue when one thinks about designing optimal taxes, the best from the point of view of society, is to balance incentives, the stimulus for people to work, versus redistribution. The society wants to redistribute from those who are lucky, high-skilled, high-income, to those who are poor or unlucky, for example, disabled or less lucky in the labor market economy. So the key difficulty is how to balance these two forces, the incentive and redistribution. There have been a lot of work on designing optimal income tax. So that's the subject of much of the literature for which actually a Nobel Prize was given to Jim Mirrlees. And the issue with this approach is that it doesn't talk about the dynamic incentives. And many of the problems that the society faces, many of the taxation and optimal benefits programs, such as Social Security, for example, are dynamic. The taxes or benefits tomorrow may affect the behavior of the people today, and vice versa. The behavior of the people today, how much they work, can affect their desire, for example, to apply for Social Security or desire for taxes. So the subject of my talk today was how to think about balancing the incentives to work versus in social insurance or distribution in dynamic frameworks. And this allows to answer a variety of questions from tax and capital, how progressive or regressive optimal income and savings taxes should be, to design of the social insurance program. So what I talk today is a unified approach to designing optimal taxes in dynamic setting.
And in this approach to merge these two different models, both micro and macro approaches, in what point is your research now? I mean, what's the next step to develop this new approach?
So this new approach is what I call the new dynamic public finance. It's a relatively recent literature, so it has been around for maybe 10 years or so. Most of the research there was primarily theoretical. And there was some quantitative research, some numerical analysis, but it was still of interest mainly to academics and people who work on the border of macroeconomic theory and public finance theory. But the inherent questions in this approach, the question of how to design taxes, are at the forefront of what the optimal policy is. So now the key issue is how to move forward from this new unified theoretical framework to deliver practical policy applications. And there are two things that needs to be done. First is theoretical advances, which would allow to characterize this very complicated theoretical issue in something that is more easily understandable. What I talk about is the key forces behind optimal taxes. That's number one. Two is to bring closer to empirical data, for example, on income redistribution, etc., and provide quantitative and empirically based implications that can guide optimal policy.
And talking about the practical impact of the research right now, what are the main questions this approach can help to answer?
So there is a variety of questions that are at the forefront of now the both economic and political discussion. So because of the economic crisis, there has been significant increase in the indebtedness of essentially all the key economies in the world, from the US to Europe. A lot of debt was issued to pay for fighting the crisis. So it's obvious that in the next 3, 4, 5 years, an important issue would be how to raise additional revenues. So the question is how to raise taxes. Should we raise taxes on the rich? Should we raise taxes on the middle class? So think about, for example, Obama's fiscal commission. So should we extend Bush tax cuts? Should we not? Should we tax capital? That's issue number one. The second is that many of the social insurance programs, for example, such as Social Security program, pension programs in much of the civilized world, much of the developed world, are running into issues of the deficits. So because of the change in demographics, many of these social insurance systems will have difficulties of being funded. So this approach would allow us to think both theoretically and practically how to improve the design of the taxes of the social insurance schemes.
And is it valid, the model, I think, is it valid for different countries or societies? I mean, you talk about incentives or social programs, and there are very different concerns about these subjects depending on the country of the model of society we talk about. Is it valid for?
So that's a very good question, and this question is often asked of the academic economists, especially who primarily working in the US or in the developed countries. But let's think for a second about the key issues I talked about: incentives versus redistribution. So this is at the center of essentially any program one wants to design. So what changes across countries is the degree of redistributionary objective of the government. So let's compare, for example, US versus Europe. So US has historically been much less redistributionary society, less involvement of the government, less desire to redistribute to those who are less lucky, versus Europe, where there is more distribution and hence more distributionary objectives of the government. So the beauty of the theoretical economics is that it provides a framework that can be then modified to the concerns of the politicians, of the electorate, of the economists to be applied to. It's not a case study, but rather a framework that can be applied to many different issues.
Talking about the crisis, the world economy is now recovering very slowly, the growth. And some people talk about the possibility of a double-dip recession. So what should policymakers do right now in terms of taxation and fiscal policies in order to help the stronger recovery of the growth?
So the key question is incentives. So the crisis have caused doubt on whether the economic system as is viable. So naturally, many of the people are calling for more redistribution, especially from the fat cats of the Wall Street, from the rich to the poor. But the right question to ask is the following: how to provide correct incentives to grow? Because it's almost obvious that if the societal pie, the economy is larger, 10% of which we redistribute is much better than 20% of a smaller economy. So the key question of the fiscal policy and of the debate of what to do should be how to promote fast economic growth. So all of the questions the particulars of the questions to ask what kind of fiscal policy is better should always put the question of the incentives at the forefront. If we solve the problem of incentives, of the fast growth, they're going to be enough to redistribute.
You have talked before about Bush tax cuts in the USA, and yesterday President Obama talked about keep the tax cuts for low and middle taxpayer and end these tax cuts for the wealthiest. Also, he announced a stimulus package with investments in education, in clean energy and technology. What's your opinion about these decisions, these proposals?
So there are several issues, I think, that has been happening. So obviously, something needed to be done to counteract the crisis. However, the problem that I have with many of these proposals is as follows. So imagine 3, 4, 5 years ago, before the crisis. Suppose you wanted to spend $2 billion, relatively not a large sum by the US standards. There would be endless questions about, do we need to spend this $2 billion? What is the market failure? Why the government intervention is needed? The problem that the crisis brought, and it's a broader problem, is that now the government, and the US government in general, is almost on a whim or on a very short notice, is able to spend hundreds of billions of dollars without asking the question, do we have strong scientific support of whether the stimulus creates jobs? Does investment in infrastructure promote growth to the extent to pay for this amount of money? Because one has to remember that if you pay the money, you increase the debt. Somebody has to pay the debt in the future. Higher debt means one has to have either the high inflation, which is bad for the economy, or to have higher taxes in the future. And the higher tax in the future slow down economic growth today. So the key question that Obama administration should be asking is, what are the incentives to promote economic growth? And there is, I think, a large body of literature that argues that one stimulus such as investment in infrastructure may not necessarily be the best to promote economic growth. For example, tax cuts may be much better way to promote a faster economic growth. The same for the extending the tax cuts and actually the proposals to potentially tax richer even more. We know that the wage income of the most skilled people in the society is a large driver of economic growth. Think about, for example, Google. So if the capital gains, for example, taxes were 90 or 60%, there would be no incentives to create these new companies that are a driver of U.S. economic growth. So the key question has to be asked is, what promotes incentives to economic growth? And B, is there strong scientific basis for doing this or that policy? And what is the market failure?
In Europe, the view nowadays is just the opposite. It's to enforce the fiscal discipline with austerity programs, and even in some countries like Spain and others, to raise taxes. So according to your view, this is not the good direction.
So one has to always remember that whatever goal you want to achieve, redistribution, paying down the debt, it's much easier to do when the economy is growing. Raising tax, or significantly raising tax, especially on the most productive elements of the society, is going to slow down economic growth. If the country grows at 2, 3, 4, 5%, it's much easier to achieve many goals. If the country grows at anemic 0%, many things are going to be much more difficult. So one way is to grow out of debt. The other thing is to restrict spendings and have the higher taxes that may slow down economic growth. Cutting down government expenditures in general is a good idea, especially I think in Europe, which is on the side of the too inefficient, too much involvement of the government. Raising taxes, which are already quite high in Europe, will, my prediction is, slow down economic growth.
Okay, let me finish talking about the regulation of financial markets. What's your vision about the proposal is being made in Europe?
So one thing that I think came out of the current crisis is that there was a failure in regulating with the financial markets. So the key question that I always ask myself is that definitely something needs to be done. But the danger is not to have the pendulum of the financial regulation to move so far that it stifles the innovation in the financial market, which is an important driver of economic growth. So the key question to ask is not what the government can do. The key question to ask is what the markets cannot do. And this will also guard against too much of the involvement of the government. Some of the proposals that have been done in Europe are clearly misguided. For example, the prohibition of the short trades. So it's again, I think, motivated by the desire of the politicians to do something without asking the right questions. And the right question is always, where do markets fail? So for example, in the US, there has been market failure on the side of the rating agencies. There has been market failure with not enough independent directors who are capable to oversee the risk of the large financial institutions. There have been market failure with respect to too big to fail, where the government bails out the banks, and the banks know that they will be bailed out, so they take too much risk and all kinds of complicated financial instruments. So the key principle of the regulation should be, where do the markets fail? And that's what the debate should be about, and that's what the electorate should be convinced by the politicians, as opposed to politicians proposing something what the government can do.
Okay, Professor Tsyvinski, thank you very much for being here with us and sharing your knowledge or your opinions.
Muchas gracias.